Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Aaron and Mark Thompson, for the invitation. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today talking about Archbishop Mowll. I was given this topic, or asked to speak on this topic. I'm going to channel my is it Anthony Green on the ABC election analyst. The paper was prepared it was written up last night in the study of the Warden's Lodge at St Paul's on an old wooden table. The table has a central pedestal that fans out, and it has a hinge on that pedestal so that it can swing up and stand upright. I've never seen another table like it. The table that this paper was prepared and written up on arrived in Sydney on the 1st of March 1934, and its owner was the new Archbishop of Sydney. Now, I'm sure you're all asking the burning question, how was it that this man came to be elected Archbishop of Sydney? Well, that is the fascinating story that I'm seeking to tell you today, and it involves a familiar cast of characters. It involves an archbishop, a former archbishop, a dean, a principal of Mowll College, several keen clergy and laity, and that perpetual misfit in the Sydney diocese, the warden of St Paul's College. To set the scene for our election, we must go back and look at what had been going on in the episcopacy of Mowll's predecessor, Archbishop John Charles Wright, who became Archbishop in 1909. Prior to election as Archbishop, Wright had been appointed Archdeacon of Manchester by the Evangelical Bishop E.A. Knox, who interestingly is the same man that Mowll wrote to upon hearing that his name was being put forward for the Archbishop, Rick, to seek advice about whether he should accept it. Judd and Cable claim that Wright won the confidence of English conservative evangelicals, being appointed a trustee of the Simeon Trust, which happened in 1903. However, the Simeon Trust had long been criticised by conservatives for moving away from its traditional evangelical position. The English Churchman uses Wright's appointment to the trust as a case in point. It says, considering Simeon's pronounced evangelical convictions, this appointment is scarcely an ideal one. We are unsure that Wright is an evangelical and Protestant of that well-defined character of which any other qualifications do not compensate. Wright's theological position had found expression in his foundational role and chairmanship of the group Brotherhood. This movement sought to restate traditional evangelical essentials such as the authority of the Bible and the atonement. Soon after his enthronement as Archbishop of Sydney, Wright filled two of the most influential offices within the diocese, Principal of Mowll College and Dean of Cathedral, with group Brotherhood members, David Davies and Albert Talbot. This meant that the leadership of the diocese and the training of the clergy had a liberal evangelical flavour. Now, while the changes that were occurring within evangelicalism were notable earlier than 1909, like I've suggested, it was after this that really the differences in theological emphasis and direction between the conservatives and the liberals proved to be insurmountable in certain areas and resulted in painful divisions. The first division was mentioned by former Archbishop Jensen. At Cambridge, a group of evangelical students there in the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union couldn't consent to the position of the InterVarsity student Christian movement on what they were holding to be basic Christian truths. And after much angst, grief and consultation in 1910, the QQ ultimately decided it had to disaffiliate with the organisation that it had originally founded. Now, such divisions soon appeared within large, iconic Anglican Evangelical societies. Perhaps most significantly was the schism within the Church Missionary Society in the 1920s. After several crucial meetings, the Conservatives concluded that the differences between themselves and the authorities in the CMS were irreconcilable and that they needed to leave and start a new society. And that resulted in the formation of the Bible Churchmen's Missionary Society, BCMS, in October 1922. Now, shortly after that, several leaders of the CMS published a book called Liberal Evangelicalism in 1923. And the founders of BCMS read the book and felt vindicated in their decision. Coinciding with this, the group Brotherhood, which Wright had been a founding member of, one of the first six and the original chairman, it had been a private group, went public. It became a public movement and took on the name the Anglican Evangelical Group Movement. Now, this movement grew rapidly and had the specific aim of increasing the influence of liberal evangelicalism within the Church of England. Now, as the 1920s went on, there was the issue of the revision of the English prayer book, which had been going on since 1906, another story. But that further exacerbated tensions between liberal and conservative evangelicals. Throughout these years, another thing became obvious. The evangelicals that were being made bishop, the majority of them were of the liberal persuasion. Such was the state of evangelicals in the Church of England at this time that Adrian Hastings stated, "Never was evangelicalism weaker than in the 1920s in vigour of leadership, intellectual capacity or largeness of heart." And in one sense that's a traditional caricature of the evangelical movement. In another sense, liberal evangelicalism was has the inverse relationship. It was at its height and growing in the years that people point to evangelicalism being in a moribund state. Now, back to Sydney. The conservative evangelicals in Sydney, for them, the anxiety that was caused with those trends in Britain were compounded by several local factors. Firstly, the Sydney Liberal and Conservative evangelicals had found themselves on different sides of the debate about the National Church Constitution in the later 1920s. In general, Liberals had promoted the Constitution, but for the Conservatives, the centralisation of authority to an organisation dominated by non-evangelicals posed too many dangers. Secondly, the Diocese of Melbourne, which was the second largest diocese and had traditionally been an evangelical ally to Sydney. In 1929, they elected Liberal evangelical Frederick Head, who was a friend, actually, of Principal Davies. And the conservative reports, like in conservative church press and so on, about Head's leadership, stated that they felt that he held to a, quote, diluted form of the gospel. And these were confirmed for the Conservatives when news circulated of Head choosing to wear a cope and mitre once he got to Melbourne. Another concern for Sydney evangelicals was the state of its own training college. Under Davies' leadership, the college had floundered. It was heavily in debt, low academic standards, and had few students. Of the students that did attend, news circulated that at least, this is in the early 1930s, at least one of the students had given up being an evangelical and their candidacy under the influences of non-evangelical forces within the college. Sydney Anglicans had witnessed the devastating effects of what was taking place in the Presbyterian Church under the influence of St Andrew's College and Samuel Angus just down the road. Of course, Samuel Angus was a friend of Principal Davies, and the possibility of Mowll College following that same path seemed likely. Well, then February 1933. Archbishop Wright goes to New Zealand for a holiday to visit his daughter, but 2 weeks later has an operation and dies in Christchurch, somewhat unexpectedly. Quite unexpectedly. The Archbishop's health had been weak for some time, but the death was unexpected, and the ordinance didn't allow for much time before the election of a successor needed to take place. And this was, as has been pointed out earlier, a pivotal moment for the diocese. Australia was still suffering from the devastating effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment was 29%. And in an age when the Archbishop was also a civic statesman, electing someone who could speak into this situation was deemed significant. Certainly the liberal evangelicals and other non-evangelicals were pushing for somebody who would be a statesman. Furthermore, conservative evangelicals were concerned with the advance of Anglo-Catholicism, which Hastings described as a vast tide flowing apparently almost irresistibly until it became something of a new normative centre of the Anglican Church by the 1930s. This was the age of Anglo-Catholicism, if we're looking at the history of Anglicanism. And 1933 was the centenary of the Oxford movement. And the Anglo-Catholics were gearing up for some celebration, I can assure you. And the conservative evangelicals were using all their efforts to try and reassert the Protestant heritage of Anglicanism. In this cultural and ecclesiastical milieu, the occasion of electing an archbishop presented the diocese with a choice of what it would stand for and in what direction it would advance. Now, the common historiography of the diocese of this election usually presents a contest between two, what appear, the way that I kind of received it and have passed it on, equally powerful sides presenting alternative futures for the diocese. In preparing this, I feel like the reality is somewhat more complicated than that. On March 24, just 2 weeks before the election, the Sydney Morning Herald claimed that between 20 and 30 overseas and Australian clerics had been discussed as potential candidates. One of the issues was trying to ascertain whether any candidate would actually come if they were elected. This was difficult back then. There were several attractive choices, like Christopher Gervais, but he indicated that he wasn't going to come. By the end of the month, it appeared that there were 3 candidates with organised support. First was the young Australian Bishop of Armidale, John Moyes, and he was backed by the Sydney Diocesan Reform Association, Professor Bland, H.N. Baker of St Thomas's North Sydney, and Arthur Garnsey, Warden of St Paul's College. We're going for the Australian. There was a fair bit in the press about how good it would be to have an Australian as the Archbishop of Sydney, and these guys were pressing their case. They did so through organised public meetings, as well as writing letters to the press. Second, as we've heard, was Joseph W. Hunken, and he apparently came, from my reading of things, pretty late into the race. The first mention of his name in the press is just 9 days before the election. He was the rector of Rugby and the Archdeacon of Coventry, but he's also the chairman of the Anglican Evangelical Group movement. His backers were Dean Talbot and Principal Davies, and they attempted to use their positions as president and vice president of the Anglican Church League to influence the vote. They believed that Hunken would be a centre of unity in a similar vein to Archbishop Wright. He would continue along that trajectory. In England, Hunken was a regular speaker at renowned evangelical conferences, sharing the platform with T.C. Hammond and so on. He had previously been the vice principal of Wycliffe Hall at Oxford. He'd made scholarly contributions to various works, including the above-mentioned liberal evangelicalism, which he wrote on the kingdom of God, and he critiqued premillennialism, which may have put some Sydney Anglicans off. Hunken and Davies were at Cambridge together, but the question of whether Hunken would accept was actually doubtful. They phoned him in the middle of the night and he said maybe he'd think about it if he was elected. They pressed their case anyway, but that's kind of where it stood. Just on Hunken, often the historiography of the diocese and some recent histories just claim he was a liberal. I'm trying to show that just branding him as liberal or modernist it's a more nuanced picture than that in the evangelical world. He came with strong credentials. The final candidate was Bishop Mowll of West China, who we're here for today. I wonder who'll win. His candidacy was announced early. It was well organised. What was it that attracted people to him? Firstly, he was a definite and uncompromising evangelical. Interestingly, back to Hunken, when Davies was writing to the paper, he always introduced him as Hunken is a definite evangelical and Protestant. Not that he was a liberal or a modernist. So Mowll comes from King's School in Canterbury up to King's College, Cambridge, 1909, heavily involved in the KICU. There's going to be a whole chapter on this in the book. But just at the decisive time of the split with the SCM, in 1910, as we heard, he becomes president for an unprecedented 5 terms. So from a very young age, Mowll had proved he would stand up for central gospel issues and lead others in doing so. Now, something I think to explore further is the fact that Davies and Hunken were both in Cambridge together as well. Davies is there through this time. He was at Emmanuel College. Hunken was at Gonville and Keys. When the split happened, and Davies was always an SCM man, just like Arthur Garnsey at St Paul's College, SCM men. And, the thought occurred to me last night as I was typing this. I mean, how much of what was going on in the politics of this election was all the way back to the Cambridge days and the SCM KICU split, and this is the very year after Howard Guinness has come and set up the Evangelical Union and the SCM sitting on the university campus. Anyway, I'll explore that more in the chapter. All right, that's one thing. He was a definite evangelical. Second thing that attracted him was his experience in theological education. As we've heard, he took up a lecturing place in Wycliffe College, Toronto. He would have had valuable insights into the inner workings and needs of theological colleges. These were assets for Sydney, which the diocese was in desperate need of. Interestingly, RBS Hammond of Barney's Broadway wrote early on when they knew that the election was just about to happen that the diocese should get someone, not from England, not from Australia, but from Canada, because they would understand what colonial ministry needs. Well, kind of Mowll fitted that case too. Thirdly, in Mowll, the Conservatives saw a valiant missionary with the evangelisation of the lost at heart. He and his wife had been missionaries, as we've heard, in this remote province of Sichuan for over a decade. They'd travelled extensively, preaching the gospel, faced many hardships. They were kidnapped, abducted, held hostage for 24 days in 1926. And then in 1932, again, they were attacked. He was stabbed in the back. She had a scar down the front of her face from that attack. That was on their way back from Sydney. They were heroes. What's more, the press in Sydney reported these stories about them. This is way before an election. 1926, the attack on Mowll in China gets a run in the Sydney Morning Herald and his abduction and so on. So they were known here. What's interesting is that once the election comes, quoted is the last letter from the beloved Archbishop Wright. The final paragraph where he talks about recent correspondence he's had with Bishop Mowll of West China. The heroic Bishop of West China is the quote. And so this, let's just say this helps the campaign somewhat. So the commendation of the late Archbishop gets quoted in the public press before the election. Fourthly, Mowll had just enjoyed a popular visit to Sydney just 18 months earlier. He'd spoken to large audiences, received great praise. He'd stayed in Bishop's Court, which he thoroughly enjoyed, perhaps measuring the curtains, I'm not sure. In other words, he was a known candidate. People knew him. He was in the press. People liked him. He already had a decade of episcopal leadership under his belt, and importantly, his supporters had ascertained that he would most probably accept if he was elected. So from very early on, he was perceived to be the favourite. Everybody saw him as the favourite. The movement promoting the election of Mowll was led by Archdeacon Langford Smith, assisted by DJ Knox and R.B. Robinson, and they organised small group meetings in parishes around the diocese to discuss the upcoming election and highlight the strengths of Mowll. Articles were written in the Australian Church Record, which was fiercely one-sided towards Mowll, and the Sydney Morning Herald had picked up on Mowll's candidature early, far more earlier than Hunken. Moyes was in the news early, but they printed pictures of Mowll, potential candidate. Hunken never had a picture. So let's just say the campaign was diligent and convincing. In the end, we get to the election synod. What will happen? 12 nominations are received. Not just 2, Hunken and Mowll. 12 nominations are received. Back in those days, you just needed a nominator and a seconder, so perhaps it wasn't too hard. After the first day, they adjourned at 11 p.m. They discussed and voted on 9 of them. 4 progressed: Mowll, Grenstead, Grant and Hunken. Grenstead and Grant I haven't gone into, both pretty conservative evangelicals in England. John Moyes hadn't been considered yet. He was going to be held off to the next day. When they got to the next day, those final 3 nominees, they were voted out, which left just 4, and they were going to put 3 on the select list. Hunken didn't make it to the select list. So in the final 3 candidates, Mowll was elected in a landslide. He collected more votes than any other candidate put together. The election synod was completed by midnight on the second day. There were calls in synod to make the election unanimous, but it wasn't the case. So there was opposition to Mowll being elected, notably Warden of St Paul's College. But there were those who voted at the end who did so reluctantly. So according to Garnsey, in a letter to his son, he said that the Dean passed a note down the aisle saying, "As Dean I must stand, but you can pass the word along to do as you wish." Surprising people, however, backed Mowll. So the following day in the paper, Father John Hope of Christ Church St Lawrence wrote, "I voted for Bishop Mowll because I have every reason to believe, on the authority of men whose word I trust, that he is a man of God and has done most praiseworthy and self-sacrificing work in Western China, and that he is a large-hearted and most approachable." So, there's a commendation from Christ Church St Lawrence, which, by the way, was where Arthur Garnsey's dad had been the rector. So despite some intransient opposition, the election result demonstrated widespread and overwhelming support for Mowll. Historiographically, Talbot and Davies have been highlighted to demonstrate the division in the diocese following the election, and there's no doubt that the election was a significant blow to them. Very soon they resigned their positions as president and vice president of the Anglican Church League, and they began a new organisation called the Anglican Fellowship. with a few other men, such as the warden of St Paul's College. And this has been described as a split in the ACL, an irreparable schism, a crisis for the breadth of evangelicalism. My contention is, however, that they were really more of the exception. Arthur Garnsey, again in a letter, describes the move of Talbot and Davies, saying, "They have come over from them to us." In his mind, this was not a split in the ACL, but a defection to a different group. Some other scurrilous accusations were made in the Church Standard and the Challenge newspapers to the effect that if Mowll had have known how the election had taken place, he would not accept. Indeed, the Challenge said that he was declining because he heard about how the majority vote was secured. Even Arthur Garnsey described this as unscrupulous journalism just to throw mud at evangelicals. Another disgruntled spectator was the Governor of New South Wales, Sir Philip Game, and he wrote to Cosmo Lang, describing and decrying the methods employed by the extreme evangelical faction. No doubt those letters are significant on Lang's discouraging farewell to Mowll that we heard about earlier. History would prove Lang wrong, as we've seen. For the diocese, the 25 years of Mowll's archiepiscopate was marked by growth, consolidation, new ventures, and that's what the rest of the day will show. They're extraordinary achievements in these years and a legacy that's still with us today. There's no doubt that the election of Mowll has been of profound and lasting significance. And so that, my friends, is the story of how a wooden table in the Warden's Lodge arrived in Sydney. And I'll leave the equally riveting tale of how the table of it was in the possession of a 44-year-old King's College alumnus, former lecturer at Colonial College, came into the possession of a 42-year-old King's College alumnus who's formerly a lecturer at a Colonial Theological College. We'll leave that story for another day. I'll leave it there.
The question is about Presbyterianism, liberal evangelicalism, and what effect that has had in strengthening evangelicalism.
I do think so. I mean, they gathered socially to talk theologically in the Heretics group, which is a discussion group still in existence to this day. Angus, Davies, Garnsey, they were a close circle of friends, and with the trouble that Angus was having and the prosecution of Angus, that was big news at the time. So, yeah.
It's a question whether Mowll made it clear that he would accept if he was elected.
He made it clear that he would most probably accept. And the question was asked to me during the week, why would he come to Sydney? And his answer was, it was put to him that it was an important evangelical post. How could he not accept? And in that letter that I referred to Knox over in Manchester, he also mentions how delightful Bishop's Court would be for entertaining. But that's it.
The question about the relationship between T.C. Hammond and Howard Mowll after this time.
Up to this time.
Up to this time.
Yeah. No, I think that's something I'd love to know more details of. And I thought that I asked you that question earlier in the week. Because, did I not? I've certainly asked... Yes, well, it's a very good question. And whether that goes back to university. Obviously, Hammond's Irish, but he was a travelling missionary. The KICU had missions. I'd love to explore that further. I think he had been to Sydney in 26, I think. Yes.
Thank you. The question is about the election and the accusation of scurrilous activity. What gave rise to that accusation?
Thanks, Eddie. Look, I think that there were things that made people disgruntled. So somebody speaking against Hunken pulled out a journal, a Modern Churchman, and showed that he used it to claim that he did not believe that the words of Scripture were the very words of God, but they thought that he was painted with a brush that was unfair in some of the arguments, I think. Because they were emphasising he's a definite evangelical. Yeah, so the fact that he'd contributed to liberal evangelicalism, even though he was on the very conservative end of that, they were the issues that people really took issue with.
The question is about the historical account of the election being on the knife edge and Ed's presentation of the detail around the election.
Thanks. Look, I've told the story 100 times too. Look, Hunken probably was the main candidate. I think that Davies and Talbot and the fallout from this, and then what goes on in the 1930s ending up in the memorial, all play into where the diocese was and which direction it was moving in. But the groundwork was in place. The history of the ACL really needs to be properly written. But the groundwork was in place by what was taking place in the late 20s over the Constitution. And as you read through the minutes of the ACL archives, you see that Davies and Talbot are increasingly on the fringe of that group.
Ed, I've got a question for you. With those who organised his campaign, are there any links between them and E.A. Knox or KICU? What sort of English links are there?
They're Australians, those guys. Links to Knox. Knox has links with lots of people. Knox, of course, was the champion against the prayer book revision. As an octogenarian, he came out of hibernation and led the cause, leading to one bishop claiming that the opposition was some octogenarians leading a group of illiterates in the opposition of the prayer book. I think Knox was a hero. He was the one, like I say, with Wright. He was there for Mowll, but I don't know that he had particular connections with those men who... Sorry, I'm talking about E.A. Knox, Edmund Knox, Bishop of Manchester, who retired in 1922.
That's
anyway,
great.
sorry. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much for fielding all those questions.